Good morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast today. I've got a fantastic guest, DV Chernov. He is actually a based in Missouri, and he is a expert in the tech area, and he has transitioned to writing novels and fiction and books. And I'm really happy to invite him on the show and talk about his work, inspire the audience who are interested in becoming authors, and I'm really happy to have him. So, DV, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah. So you have an interesting journey. And so talk about how you got to where you are. And I'm excited to dive into the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a kind of quick overview. I'm a first generation immigrant. So I actually was born and lived in the former Soviet Union till I was 18. And then I immigrated to the US, went to study, eventually settled here, and have done just a lot of various things. Really took me a while to figure out, I guess, where I belonged in my professional career. I have done higher education. I've done teaching. I worked for high tech companies for over 20 years. And now, as you said, I'm following my lifelong dream of writing. So I've been excited to focus on that.
Yeah. I love that. My parents were first generation and I always grew up loving reading like Michael Crichton and John Grisham. And you've taken a like similar career approach. So really interesting. So talk about like I really love how you take your experience from the former the Soviet Union and then your background in technology and crime and how you integrate these technologies into your crime novels without overshadowing the human elements of the story because you talk about AI in your novels.
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked in technology for over 2 decades now, and there's been a lot of change, clearly. And I think the pace of evolution of technology just continues to accelerate. If you think about AI being a science fiction thing 5 years ago, within the last couple of years became a household topic. And you have kids using it, you have professionals using it as well. So it's fascinated me how technology impacts our daily lives, but also it feeds some of our ancient desires and fears that we've always had as humans. And it just intensifies them or reflects them in interesting ways. And so I've really found that technology really is pervasive in today's world. And in some ways, it makes the world smaller. But in some ways, I think it also pushes us apart in ways. And I love exploring that through my books.
I love that. And as exploring crime and thrillers from your lens, what were some of your influences and inspirations? What were your biggest influences in these genres and how they shaped your writing style? Any books or authors or events that really motivated you to develop this style?
Yeah, I've always loved crime fiction. I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes novels. I just devoured them, just loved it as a kid. And I maybe took a break from reading that genre for a while as I grew up and had my professional career. But I think some of the interests as I went into the technology space, began to study cybersecurity, and just realizing how technology both helps both sides of crime, right? You have organized crime, you have individual vigilantes who may use cyber technology in general, high tech to achieve their goals. But you also have law enforcement, right? And sometimes I think law enforcement is playing catch up. There's a lot of considerations that they have to make. There's privacy, there's legality of using this technology. Every now and then you hear about a law enforcement agency or federal agency getting into hot water with use of technology. But it just fascinated me, the sort of arms race that's happening in the criminal world around the use of high tech and how quickly criminals can adopt it and begin using it, and then law enforcement trying to keep up.
Yeah, it's interesting because like cybersecurity, like a career in cybersecurity is like a thing now. It's like you can actually make a career out of it. A follow-up question I have for you is when you write these novels, because I've had people do what you did, and sometimes they were trying to create a narrative, for example, like Chuck Palahniuk, and he's like talking about the darker side, or are you trying to write to entertain, or is it just embedded narratives to talk about the deeper issues in our society? Like sometimes, like in the past, like artists, they would create these wonderful works, but they were actually had some like meaning against, for example, against oppression, or what is your motivation?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Man, that's an insightful question. I try to balance, of course. I want my work to be entertaining, but again, as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the technology world and also in with exposure to global political landscapes and everything else that happens in the world today, I do like to make sure that my works reflect some kind of a position, or at least ask a question, right? And make the reader questions like, what is this going too far, right? Are we going perhaps too fast with some of these technologies? Am I relying a little too much on this, on social media or on some of the new AI capabilities? I think that's always there, right? And I think that again, I've lived and breathed technology for so long now, it's hard for me to imagine a world without it, but it's also I think there's a lot to consider and maybe take a little pause and say, how do we ensure that we're on the right path with this just as fast as things are going? I think it's a question we must ask ourselves at this point. So, yeah, absolutely. Both trying to entertain as well as educate a little bit. And I'll say this, my novels, even though technology is a theme, they're not super techy. I wouldn't call them tech thrillers. They have a lot of lay characters. One of my main characters is a detective in a small town, Colorado, and he's a self-professed Luddite. He doesn't like using technology. He likes a mechanical watch. Like, that's his personality, but he's thrust into modern day crimes and has to learn and pick up some of the jargon and some of the technology in order to solve the crimes.
Fascinating. And coming from the former Soviet Union, how has your background and experiences changed your perspectives on technology and how these technologies are being used? Especially, for example, because when you think about the West, it's like the U.S. is the global reserve, but you have these new emerging technologies. How do you view it? Because you have a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, and the East-West relationship, that's certainly been rocky for a while now. And so you see a lot of these topics kind of surface there, like cyber crime, cyber warfare is a new term now, right? So there's actual divisions and governments who focus on cyber operations using nothing but high tech. So the capabilities of cyber technology, cyber warfare have expanded greatly. It started out with something small. You could potentially affect a nuclear reactor, right? In the control panel that operates, if that's something that's happened in history, right? You could actually create a malfunction there remotely. And it goes to even today, as we watch the war in Ukraine unfold, there was a considerable arm of cyber warfare that was actually conducting operations in Ukraine, disrupting telecommunications, disrupting the power grid, disrupting traffic, things like that. We take these things for granted. You walk out in the street or you get in your car and, hey, your GPS works and traffic lights work. And everything is great in the world, but just a little monkey wrench in the operation, and it can create tremendous disruption. So I think with my background growing up in Russia, growing up in the Soviet Union at the height of Cold War, and really getting to see the Cold War ideological conflict from both sides of the Iron Curtain, I see it still unfolding, and it fascinates me. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for diplomacy, for economic actions. I think technology is just going to continue being a weapon or a tool, depending on how we use it.
Yeah. And a follow-up to that is there's a new modern technology, and you mentioned disrupting supply lines or power grids, like these kind of mass cyber warfare on that type of scale. But the military industrial complex still exists, so there's still physical warfare, like violence and exploitation by governments and countries. How do you approach these sensitive subjects in your writing? Because you explore these deep psychological themes.
Yeah, absolutely. I do write crime fiction, but I also write historical fiction, and so I have two series going now, and one is the one I mentioned called Nick Sever's Mysteries, which kind of pits modern day crimes and gives them technological undertones, and also explores how they affect modern day issues like human trafficking, like violence against women, just regular sort of run-of-the-mill extortion, if you wish, that can happen in cyber world. But I also have the historical fiction series going, which is actually tied to the world of today, of my characters in the Nick Sever stories. but they explore the generational background of one of the characters, Claire, and her family who came from revolutionary Russia and ended up in the US. So these topics continue connecting. And I think as we watch the modern warfare and how the sort of the traditional, right, the physical warfare that happens, as you called it, and how it interacts with the new technologies, we're seeing that again. It just reinforces some of these old themes, some of these old beliefs. Technology can basically amplify a hundredfold whatever agenda, whatever ideological goal that an actor may have.
Yeah. I know we're coming to the end and you're obviously very creative. And so what is your writing process like and how do you balance research with creativity? I'm just curious, what is your creative process?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I know it's probably different for everybody, so this highly subjective. But what I found is that I tend to work well with a very structured process. So I've been wanting to write for decades, and I always waited for inspiration to hit. Just when the house is quiet and I have a couple hours, I'll sit down and I'll knock out masterpieces. It doesn't work that way for me. I learned that it has to be basically a second job. So whatever it is you do day to day, you have to add an additional regimen to that. For me, it's getting up early in the morning, a couple hours before I start my professional work, and really put in the work. Like it has to come in layers. You're not going to mint masterpieces just with every keystroke. You have to do the first draft fast and furious. Then you come back and just layer it, just like a painting. You add detail later, right? You got to get the whole exposition out on paper and understand how the characters develop and how the plot flows. So that's what works for me. And to your question about research, that can be such a rabbit's hole with historical fiction because my instinct is I want to get it right. I don't want to make a silly mistake and say that something happened in a time where it didn't. Diving into tremendous amounts of research done on the topic of my historical novel, which is Russian Civil War and foreign intervention in Russian Civil War, which was US, UK, France, actually sending troops that landed in Russia and actually engaged militarily with the Russian army in 1918, 1920 period. There's so much great historical literature done on that. And there's also a lot of primary research. So all of that is within access. And my ability to read in Russian, I can go into archives and actually pull up memoirs, notes, diaries of people who actually lived in that history over 100 years ago and see their daily notes, see their interactions and their reactions to what's going on in the country at the time. So yeah, to your point, it can be a rabbit's hole. And sometimes I have to pull myself back and say, okay, wait, I've just spent an hour reading this material. I haven't written the words, but you have to reel yourself back in sometimes. But it's something I love. So in the end, I think it's all worth it.
Yeah. I know. And I know some, do you ever, like, for example, I used to be a fan of Michael Crichton and he would actually, for his books, he would actually go and travel to places, get that feeling, conduct interviews. Is that part of your process or is yours just very desk just to get a feel for that and how you collect?
Yeah, I think, again, with technology today, you can certainly do a lot from your desk. You can get on Google Streets and make turn-by-turn navigations through the city, but there's nothing like being there yourself. And so every time I get a chance, we travel quite a bit, my family and I, and so we love to go and whenever possible, I want to make those stops that are relevant to my books and get a sense for the place. What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What kind of things do you see when you're at a window there? I think it's invaluable, but yeah, sometimes, unfortunately, you just don't have the time or the budget to go everywhere you'd like to, but I try every chance I get.
Interesting. How can people find out more about you and check out your work? And it's really fascinating work that you're doing.
Yeah. So my author website, dchernov.com, has information about my books. Most of them are available as paperback, audiobooks, or ebooks as well. And I attend various fairs and events as well, do online events, and I appreciate this opportunity in particular. Yeah, drop me a line if you're interested in the stories or if you're interested in the history behind them. I love connecting with readers and sharing the knowledge that I've accumulated.
Yeah. And really enjoyed talking with you. And for the audience, be sure to check out DD's socials and check out his book as well. And thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.